You are listening to the War on the Rocks podcast on strategy, defense, and foreign affairs. My name is Nicholas Danforth. In February, I sat down with three leading experts on Latin America to talk about recent developments and broader trends across the region. First, we have Agustina Giraudy, an associate professor at American University's School of International Service and the author of the 2015 book, Democrats and Autocrats. We also have Adam Isacson, who runs the Defense Oversight Program at the Washington Office on Latin America, a human rights advocacy and research organization. Finally, we're joined by Anya Prusa, currently Senior Director at the Albright Stonebridge Group's America practice and former head of the Brazil Institute at the Wilson Center. Thank you all for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you for the invite.
To start off, we have a lot of subjects to cover, but I wanted to begin with domestic politics. Agustina, I wonder if you could give us a brief overview of what some of the biggest trends are in Latin America right now.
Sure. Well, thank you so much for the invitation. I would like to point to three main trends that we're seeing in Latin America today. The first one is the rise of the left again. So we're back to the 2000s where the left dominated the political arena in most countries in Latin America. Second trend is democratic backsliding in big countries and small ones, such as Central American countries, Nicaragua being one of them. And finally, the third trend, which I see also related to the second one, is the increasing militarization in Latin America. So let me start with the first one. So Latin American countries were ruled by the left starting in 1998 with the election of Hugo Chavez. He was the first to inaugurate that first turn to the left. And we had presidents in several countries, such as Lula and Dilma Rousseff in Brazil, Lagos and Bachelet in Chile, Tabaré Vázquez in Uruguay, the Kirchners in Argentina, Evo Morales in Bolivia. And those governments ended at some point as a result of bad economic performance. They did very, very well. But at some point, part of their success had to do with the boom in commodity prices, right? So that boom came to an end in around 2012, 2013. And of course, those governments could not deliver anymore, especially with social welfare. And new governments were elected, right-wing governments. Now, back to last year and post-pandemic, many countries decided to go back to the left. And so we see Lula coming back to power, Fernandez in Argentina, Boric in Chile, Petro in Colombia. For the first time, we have a left-leaning president in Colombia, Arce in Bolivia. Yet, this new left is very, very different from that left because the economy is not doing that well. So a huge question mark emerges as to how is this new left going to perform, given that they don't have the resources that they had when they were back in those years and very successful.
Before we get to that question, as well as the other trends, which I very much want to come back to, can I pause to ask you or any of the other guests what explains the second wave rise of the left over the post-pandemic turn?
Well, so all incumbents have done very poorly during the pandemic. All the presidents that were presidents during the pandemic and their own parties, they were not reelected, right? So we see this happening in not just in Latin America, but all across the globe. So there's something about performance during the pandemic that explains the backlash against the.
And I would argue that it predates the pandemic to a certain extent, right? That you've seen economies across the region underperforming, and you've seen that citizens themselves are not necessarily reaping the benefits of any economic gains that are occurring. And so there has been rising frustration, I think rising dissatisfaction with how the governments are addressing the needs of the people. And so we have seen a wave of protests across the region that predates even the pandemic. Of course, the pandemic worsened the situation, right? We saw severe economic contraction in government in countries across the region, and that's made it even more hard for incumbent governments to hang on to power, and I think has contributed to this rise of anti-establishment sentiment, which in this case has benefited the left.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I'm older. So I got out of grad school and I was in college in the late 80s, early 90s, which was, this time of, Samuel Huntington's third wave of democracies, right? And every country in Latin America was either ending a civil war or giving way from dictatorship to democracy. And I started working in this field at a very hopeful time. And I would say that the mid to late 2000s was a particularly optimistic time. For the first time, you had leftist leaders being elected freely and fairly and not being knocked out by their militaries, not being knocked out by the United States, which was very distracted at the time in the post 9/11 climate. And with the high commodity prices, it looked like, prosperity. You saw inequality, which has historically dogged Latin America, reducing. A pretty hopeful time. There were some seeds of trouble. There were rising crime, especially violent crime and homicide rates in much of the region, increasing gang activity, a growing sense in some places that democracy couldn't protect people and from day-to-day threats. But in general, a high watermark, like Lula's second term in Brazil, when his approval rating is usually north of 70% most of the time. But then, as has been said here, commodity prices took a big dive circa 2013, 2014. People started falling back into poverty. You saw a lot of street protests 2018, 2019 in several countries around the region, and then COVID came. And yeah, that's a lot of upheaval, and it has benefited the left for now. But if they can't deliver in a few years, we'll see what way the pendulum swings.
I'd like to tell you about a new members-only show called Unspent Rounds, featuring interesting conversations with interesting people.
Today, I'm joined by Adam A.I. Solomon. You were managing the evacuation of the Kabul airport, were you not?
That is correct, yes. That was primarily my job, yes. First job was to find out who's in charge and where I can fit in.
How chaotic really was it?
The entire time I was there, very chaotic. I think I slept a few hours a day, essentially falling asleep to the sound of gunfire or something going on. And at that point in time, I think I was so sleep deprived, I didn't think twice about it. I was like, all right, cool, let's go talk to the Taliban.
Become a member and tune in to Unspent Rounds, as well as our other members-only podcasts.
Now, Agustina, that brings us back to your next point. What about the threats to democracy? What about democratic backsliding?
Right. So we have seen quite recently some very serious attempts to bring democracy down, and I'm referring to the case of Brazil. We were expecting this, or I was expecting this. I was very surprised that this did not happen right after Lula was elected. So I was not surprised at all by what happened. I think that this is a very worrying trend. We see other cases, not as big as Brazil, in which democracy has died already. The case of Nicaragua is the most clear example. Venezuela, another example. But I think that Brazil here is one of the most worrying cases, not only because it's the biggest country in the region, but also because it's kind of copying the model that we have here in the US, right? And so the connections between the democratic backsliders in the US and the Brazilian ones is very tight. We know that there are lots of resources flowing from one end to the other. And Brazil is a very polarized society. And so Bolsonaro and the Bolsonaristas have a lot of support, and they are pretty much against whatever Lula is going to make. And this also relates to the third trend, which we're going to talk about later, which has to do with the militarization and the rising power of the military in Brazil and the police forces as well.
I wonder if I could just jump in on that point,
please.
Because I think, when you look at Brazil, it's really important to make a distinction between, Brazil's short-term situation as a democratic power, right, and its long-term situation. And I think in the short term, interestingly enough, the January 8th invasion and attacks on the Brazilian capital have really reinforced belief in democracy and support for the Lula government in Brazil. And that's true on the left, the center, and the center-right. Obviously, former President Bolsonaro, retains this core base of supporters who are against the current government, no matter what that government does. But you've seen, governors on the left and right, you saw leaders in Congress who are more conservative kind of step up and say, this attack on the Capitol, wasn't justified, that there's no way that this should have happened, and that measures need to be taken to prosecute those who were involved, not just those who stormed the government buildings, but also those who helped organize and finance. And so I think that is incredibly powerful, at least in the short term. In the long run, where you will see problems is the fact that this new government faces an incredible challenge in overcoming the polarization that Agustina mentioned. And I would say it even goes towards calcification, right? It's not just that people are polarized, it's that they're past the point of being able to hear arguments from the other side. There's this reflexive, anti, them versus us, right? They are the other. And so I think this is something that's going to be incredibly hard in the long run for the Lula government to overcome. And that has long-term implications for democracy in Brazil.
Now, I also wanted to ask you, we had you on the Warcast a little while ago to talk about this, and you mentioned, and we didn't get to follow up on it, the people who stormed the Brazilian government were camped out on a military base, were they not, before this happened? I mean, talking about militarization, what was the role of the military in this?
Yes. So after Lula was elected in late 2022, you saw Bolsonaro protesters take to the streets, but they were also camping out in front of military barracks across Brazil. And that includes in Brasilia, the capital city. And so on January 8th, protests had grown up around the military barracks in that city, and that's where the protest march actually began, right? And as they marched, they turned from a protest into a riot, right, into violent attacks on the Capitol buildings. And in the aftermath, there was a lot of criticism of the military's role and the role of public security forces in Brasilia, that they hadn't done enough to contain those mobilizations, and they hadn't done enough to kind of predict that they would have occurred. There was intelligence suggesting, right, that this might have happened. And so we've seen, investigations, we've seen initial actions that the Brazilian government has taken. For example, President Lula fired the head of the army shortly after the attacks for insubordination because he hadn't done enough. He hadn't obeyed orders to clear the protesters, right, who were camped out. And so there have been some actions taken to deal with this. But again, the government, the Lula government, has to be particularly careful that it doesn't push too hard, right? That it doesn't antagonize the military or the public security forces and kind of harden opposition within the ranks. So it really is a delicate balancing act that they're going to have to take.
Yeah, we're speaking we're recording this on February 13th, and just a few days ago, Presidents Biden and Lula sat down and met, and it was sort of like a mini summit of the few post-populist presidents in the world, because very few of them, and in both cases, the parallels, you have people who were familiar faces, probably reassuring to a lot of people after a very chaotic presidency. And that sense of chaos was hugely, reinforced by January 6th and by January 8th in both of our countries, and gave both presidents something of a boost, as we saw in the November midterms here. It's interesting the job of a post-populist president is still hard because the populist movement is strong and polarization or calcification is also extremely strong. But that populist authoritarianism, whatever you want to call that modern playbook, where you can never quite say when a country actually turns into a dictatorship. All you know is there's like death by 1,000 cuts and it suddenly happens. That's still around in Latin America. You obviously have the advanced phases in Venezuela and Nicaragua where nobody argues that it's not a dictatorship anymore. But what do you make of López Obrador's Mexico, or Bukele's El Salvador, where they both are governing with quite a lot of popularity, but ignoring checks and balances as much as they can, and in both cases, aggressively courting the military.
Well, and also to add to that, too, Venezuela, Brazil, these were cases where the threats to democracy seemed very clear. It seems like in Peru, in Bolivia more recently, you had situations where it was actually complicated, at least for those of us watching without a huge background, to figure out what exactly the democratic outcome was. Can I get any of you to talk more about that?
I can just launch, but others will say more intelligent things. But both of those countries, you had elections that were either super, super close or decided, without a candidate that had anything like a mandate. In Bolivia, it was close enough that there could be allegations of fraud back and forth. We still don't know the whole story in Bolivia, but whoever won was not considered, legitimate. And then in Peru,
it's ongoing, right? In Peru, there's still no.
In Peru, Pedro Castillo won the first round of the elections with 16% of the vote, which then had to go to a runoff, which was razor thin also. So nobody had a strong mandate to begin with, and all they had to do was govern chaotically or not well. And nobody really predicted Castillo would finish his term, and he lasted about as long as I think most expected.
Well, and then for people who haven't been following this as close, give us more of a sense of how these dynamics have played out and how they relate to the dynamics in some of the other countries that people are probably more familiar with.
So I think that Peru is quite an outlier in Latin America, in part because this is the only country in which political parties are not strong, and that's why we have presidents that last for months only in Peru, right? So political parties, they are created just to win elections and then they disappear. They don't survive the whole electoral cycle. So I think that when analyzing these two cases, we need to make a distinction. In the case of Bolivia, you have a very strong, well-rooted party, the MAS, which has lots of mechanisms of internal accountability. And that's the reason why Evo Morales is not there anymore. And we have Luis Arce as the president of Bolivia. So very different countries when it comes to the institutionalization of key institutions such as political parties. So there, I think that it's important to mark that difference. Peru is quite an outlier in Latin America, which is interesting, right? Because, these are countries that are relatively new to democratic politics, but still we see that political parties have consolidated in the last 40 years or so. Peru, that has not been the case, and that's why we see what we see, right? Chaos.
Just to emphasize that, Peru has had 6 presidents in as many years, right? So it really is an outlier in terms of the amount of political turnover and chaos. And that speaks as well, to the point that there are no leaders in Peru who have true popular legitimacy, right? Even in the midst of this crisis, we're not seeing anyone emerge who can really lead the country forward.
Now, this brings up something I've been meaning to ask. Are there differences within the left in Latin America? Or does it make sense to talk about populism on the left as well as the right, for that matter?
Some things that come to mind, I'm sure you guys can come up with better examples. Do you criticize the human rights records of, say, Cuba and Nicaragua, even though they're left governments, or do you just stay quiet about it? Boric, to a lesser extent, but significant extent, Petro and Lula have criticized those countries' human rights records, asked them to release prisoners. How are you on social issues? The environment, right. LGBTQ rights, women's rights. A lot of the old dinosaur left populists are pretty bad. And they're for strip mining and anything else and don't really little more than lip service to things like indigenous and other historically marginalized groups' rights. But the more lefty presidents who are less populist, I would say, will do more on that agenda.
Yeah, I always find it very useful, this distinction that we have in academia. When we teach the new left, we talk about 2 different types of lefts, the contestatory left and the moderate left, and that aligns exactly with what you, you have just said. So the contestatory left, examples are Venezuela, Bolivia with Evo Morales, Ecuador with Rafael Correa. The moderate left, in turn, is Chile, Uruguay under Tabaré Vázquez and Pepe Mujica, Brazil under Lula. And the key difference is not what you just mentioned, but also the idea that the moderate left governments, they were more respectful of horizontal accountability, checks and balances. They never incarcerated opponents. They never engaged in electoral rigging. Whereas in the case of the contestatory left, all of these presidents, they crashed the Supreme Courts, they crashed Congress. They also rewrote the constitutions to extend their terms. And so we see very marked differences among these two back then. It's interesting to see if those categories that were developed to analyze the left in the early 2000s are going to apply to this new wave of left-leaning governments. So where does Petro fall? Into which of these categories? We don't know that yet. But so we are also in academia
Depends on his last tweet.
Right. So we're trying to see if those categories that worked very well to distinguish among two different types of ruling are still valid today.
And then what about, because we're now trying to triangulate, I guess, the moderate left, the populist left, and of course the populist right. And I don't know if you want to add in a more traditional or pre-populist right. I mean, how would you also explain those splits?
Well, I mean, when right-leaning governments came to power in between the two waves of the left, in academic settings, there was also this idea, well, we should be able to distinguish between different types of rights, right? So you had the right of Macri in Argentina, you have the right-leaning presidency of Piñera in Chile, and then you had Uribe in Colombia, right? So very different also. One more populist-leaning, the other more institutionalist. The problem is that they were very short-lived. And so academics, we are always lagging behind. So we do not have time to actually see if those categories, but there were very marked differences. So especially Uribe and Macri and Piñera in the case of the Southern Cone.
I think in Latin America, one distinction I would make among, different stakeholders on the right is not unlike what we would see in the United States. There is this economic conservative force, right, which is more in favor of market-based policies, fiscal responsibility, encouraging foreign investment, and these types of policies, and a more social-based right, which cares deeply about social issues such as LGBTQ plus rights, the role of women, and these types of issues. And so I do think one distinction you can make is between, where do people fall on the economic versus the social spectrum? And it's not, the two don't always go hand in hand in Latin America, which I think is a really interesting point.
Wait, can you say more about that?
So, for example, you can have someone like Marina Silva, who is the current Minister of the Environment in Brazil, a member of the Lula government, very much on the left, and she is an evangelical, right? And in the past has held quite traditional views when it comes to, same-sex marriage, abortion, and this type of thing, right? She has moderated over the years, but she is still very much an evangelical, and she is on the left. And so there's no contradiction in that. That said, evangelicals in Brazil on the whole do tend to lean more conservative, right? They supported President Jair Bolsonaro, including in his re-election bid, because he very much was in favor of more traditional family values. Bolsonaro himself, however, is a contradiction, right? Because he is a conservative on social issues. But if you look at his economic policy and the history of that policy, he's much more of a nationalist. So he's a bit more populist when it comes to economic policy. And he was really pulled to the more orthodox economic right because of the need to win votes among the business elite and the business community in Brazil. So you saw him appoint, Paulo Guedes as his Minister of Economy to establish those fiscal credentials. But Bolsonaro himself was not a true believer in pro-market policies.
Can we talk more about religion for a minute? Because we do, how do religion and politics relate? How does as I understand it, rapid growth of evangelical Christianity in the region factor into this, the left-wing Catholic tradition?
Which has surpassed the amount of Catholics that we have in Latin America. Today, the dominant religion, the dominant religion in Latin America, if you think about Mexico, if you think about Brazil, Argentina, is evangelicalism. So clearly, and we know both from what Anya said, that Bolsonaro and also Andrés Manuel López Obrador, they won with the vote of the evangelicals. So there is, in terms of electoral politics, they are key actors to winning elections. The problem is that one thing is to win elections and another thing is to rule a country, right? So when you're ruling a country, maybe those presidents, or I'm thinking about presidents of the left, and Lula is actually also dealing with that because he also won with a coalition of evangelicals as well. Once they are in power, they want to implement a more progressive agenda. And that agenda does not necessarily align with the principles of evangelicals, right? So I think that it's important to distinguish between two moments in the electoral cycle. One is to win elections where those votes are critical, but then you have to rule and enact policies. And those voters that voted for you might not like the policies that you implement as a left-leaning president. And I think that for Lula in particular is going to be a huge challenge.